And by talking about, in my experience of the Native way, how we're going to organize this particular grouping. I like to think of it as I do in my weekly program, Living Dialogues, here every Sunday on KGNU, as a dialogue circle that we're all in. And we're in a semicircle up here, and we'll begin seeding this whole conversation and dialogue about Native history and literatures. And then at a certain point, we're going to open up the circle. So in a sense, you're the second half of the circle, even though we're in a kind of modern building, modern structure, which has people up on a stage, normally presenting PowerPoint, whatever, some kind of one-way knowledge, and then they're the recipients, and we're going to reimagine this whole space as a sort of fire-keeping circle, which really reflects the way in which Native history and literature and culture has evolved. And we're going to also tell personal stories, and in that particular narrative way, complement the information and use that as a means of communicating our own thoughts and feelings about it. And at the end, I'm going to invite people, conscious, of course, of the time limitation, that if you want to get up and share a story or make a comment or ask a question to any one of the panelists or all of them, fine. But you're not going to be limited to question and answer. This is how I've done it in these formats for a long time, and that's how we'll do it here today. And we'll start by basically having each one of us give a little personal story to sort of set the stage, if you will, and then we'll engage in dialogue together and then open up the circle. The main point, besides that, is simply that in this kind of format where people are not presenting prefabricated outlines or material or simply information, the level I have found of your deep listening and our deep listening to each other, the level of attentiveness is very much a factor of co-creation in what emerges here in our entire circle today. So I've seen that there's a direct correlation of the deep listening and what gets evoked from those of us that are vocalizing on this topic at any given time. So I want to thank you in advance for your not only coming, but for your presence. And I would like now to share a personal story of mine, which is how I came to this feeling of Native experience myself. My first conscious memory as a 6-year-old person was not in any particular time or place, but I experienced, you might say, the awe and wonder of the world, the natural world, what we're here on this planet. And I had a knowingness that the reason I was here was to deepen that particular experience of a fully alive universe as much as I could, and then share that with other people. And I'd been born into a Catholic family, and so I assumed I was supposed to be a priest. But by the time I got to high school, I realized that that particular experience was not being understood or seen by the people within the institution. And so in my teenage years, the institution of the church fell away. And over time, what emerged for me was a connection with my Celtic heritage, Scottish, Irish, and oftentimes the Celts are referred to as the indigenous of Europe. They were the original pagans that inspired the creation of original sin, actually, to control more the emanation of Catholicism in the Celtic lands. And that was St. Augustine who did that in his book Confessions. So they've always been a people of spirit, people of the land, people in the bardic tradition of telling stories and the carriers of culture in that particular way. So I have always personally felt a tremendous affinity in my own personal life with what we know here in the United States as the Native American culture. I'm married to a First Nations woman from Canada who herself is a mixed blood of French and Cree and Haida and Welsh. And I see this kind of emerging, deeper understanding between these cultures as very much at the heart of how we will have to be as a species if we're going to move forward in these critical times. I would go so far as to call it an evolutionary imperative. We need to reawaken our indigenosity, which is in the psychic and physical DNA of every one of us as part of our human heritage. But the modern mind has really pushed a great deal of that away and, in my view, overemphasized in almost an adolescent way the hubris of technology. And you will see yesterday, for instance, here in the panel in this very space, on the lure of the land and the sea, that there was a tremendous energy here when people on the panel were talking about the natural world and their connection with it. And there was the equivalent of a standing ovation at the end. The room was filled with a certain kind of energy because people were all connected to that. And so that's my personal story. It's how I've come to do my living dialogues. And I see this marriage happening of a deeper, deeper understanding in our modern culture of the gifts of Native history and literature and their profound understanding of being in a living universe of all my relations. And to the extent we can feel that, then we can actually move to connect with their wisdom around the resiliency needed for climate change and so on. So that's my story, and I'd like to move now to Debra Magpie Earling, who is a Bitterroot Salish and a member of the Flathead Nation. She is the author of the acclaimed novel, Perma Red, winner of the American Book Award, and another beautiful book available online only, The Lost Journals of Sacagawea. She teaches at the University of Montana. And so, Debra, welcome.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to say that I'm so privileged to be on this panel and privileged to be here in Boulder. What a beautiful day, and thank you for coming to listen to this panel and listen to our stories and our perspectives on, when you could be someplace outside where it is, truly wonderful. I have a story that keeps coming back to me, and I was going to tell the story, how do you choose a story that defines how you began the process of writing. And there's one story that keeps emerging for me that has to do with women, and not just Indian women. Years ago, when my great-grandmother, she had lost her husband, and she was living with she had lost her daughter, Annie Charlotte, to pneumonia. She was taking care of 4 young girls. And there was a man who lived up behind her allotment, and he was from Central Europe. And he was one of those old misers who never washed his jeans. His jeans were stiff. He liked to drink grapefruit juice, and he had cans and cans and cans on his front porch. And one day he realized he was lonely, and he got a mail-order bride to come from the old country. And everybody thought that Mrs. Vullis, when she arrived, would be wide-hipped and big-handed, ready to work hard. And so everyone was awaiting her arrival. And when she pulled into the train station in Perma, everyone noticed when she got off the plane and got off the train, because she was described as ethereal. Like back then, she had platinum blonde hair to the middle of her back. She had ice blue eyes. She was one of the most beautiful. My grandmother described her as an angel when she got off the train. And there's old Mr. Vullis. And he comes and he gets her. And he takes her away in his buckboard wagon. And so my grandmother thought, well, they're newlyweds. We'll give them some time. So one day, it was a hot August day. She decided she was going to go take some fry bread and take some coffee and go pay a visit to Mrs. Vullis. She knew Mr. Vullis was out in the fields until dark. So she went up to the house, and the first thing she noticed was all the blinds were shuttered. and there was no movement in the house at all. She knocked on the door, she called out, she heard nothing. And because it was a hot day, she sat down on the porch, and she heard something in the back of the house, like kind of a rattling. And then she was getting ready to go, and she heard a shrill shrieking from the back of the house, and she dropped everything and ran to the back of the house. And there she discovered Mrs. Vollis was chained to a tree with water, with a dish of water. She was left like a dog. She had some rations. And she was in her nightgown, and she had trailed around and around this tree. And my grandmother was horrified, and she ran to find Mr. Vollis. She couldn't find him. She ran, and in those days, didn't have a car. She had to walk to the agency, which was 15 miles away, and my great-grandmother made that walk in her moccasins, and she came to the Indian agent and she said, Mr. Vollis has chained his wife up behind his house. That's what's going on up there. You have to do something. And so he said, it's none of your business. And I don't believe you anyway, but it's none of your business even if he had. It was one of those stories that when my mother told me that sparked, of course, my imagination. And she was never released from, well, eventually when she got pregnant, Mrs. Vollis was released from her prison. She had 4 sons. She grew up. She had an incredible resiliency, but she went crazy. And she used to say, the whole world is crazy. So that story and my own great-grandmother's resilience, and my mother's and her sisters, after having witnessed these things, the violence that's done to Indian women in our communities, and the violence that's done to women overall, these are the stories that called to me.
Thank you so much, Deborah. And I'd like to now invite Elizabeth Fenn. Elizabeth received the 2015 Pulitzer Prize for Encounters at the Heart of the World, A History of the Mandan People. She is also the author of Pax Americana, The Great Smallpox Epidemic of 1775 to 82. She lives in Longmont, and she chairs the History Department at CU Boulder. Lil.
Thank you. Is that on? Okay. It's really a delight to be here this morning, and especially to share the stage with my colleagues here. One of the things that I think is so striking about us is how we come to our work by such different paths. My own introduction to the world of writing, and particularly to Native American history, was circuitous. I often tell my students they don't need to do it the way I did it. I actually dropped out of graduate school to become an auto mechanic. And it was a study in downward mobility. My parents were not thrilled by this decision. But fixing cars was great. It taught me a lot. It taught me a lot about humility. It taught me to respect and love people who were different from myself. I worked in the South. I was in these sort of all-male, all-white shops in North Carolina. Now, one of the benefits of doing manual labor is that when you go home at night, you don't have a bunch of like journals you've got to catch up on. And you don't have reading to catch up on. You can drink beer and read whatever the heck you want. And that was absolutely liberating to me. And I did that. And eventually my learning curve in the shop kind of flattened. both my social learning curve and my physical mechanical learning curve flattened out. And I was becoming kind of bored with fixing cars. And a friend of mine gave me a marvelous book to read by a man named Jean Giono. And the book is called The Horseman on the Roof. It's a French novel. Don't worry, I read it in English. It's a French novel about a cholera epidemic sweeping an Italian nobleman trying to find his way home through Provence in the midst of this 19th century cholera epidemic. And I was taken by Jean Giono's ability to write something beautiful about something terrible. That actually propelled me back into graduate school, led me to write the dissertation that became the book, the first book that Duncan mentioned, called Pax Americana. I don't think I came anywhere near to Jean Giono's ability to write something beautiful about something terrible. This was truly something terrible. But in the midst of researching that book, I came across this people called the Mandans. Now, I had known about the Mandans because I knew about Lewis and Clark. And Lewis and Clark spent their first winter among the Mandans in 1804, 1805. And that's kind of when the Mandans showed up in American history. And then that's it. And what I found there, researching this first book, just blew me away. You know, here were just 15,000 people at the center of the continent. And that prompted me to wonder, what would happen if I told American history from their perspective? How would that change the story? How would that change our narrative? And that became a really sort of compelling force and led me to do Native American history.
Thank you, Lil, so much. That was great. And now I'm going to move on to Patty Limerick, known to many of you here. And I guess one of the many things you've written, Patty, we'll talk about legacy of conquest. You're the faculty director and chair of the board of the Center of the American West at the University of Colorado. And you've dedicated your career, it says here, among other things, to bridging the gap between academics and the general public and demonstrating the benefits of historical perspective on contemporary dilemmas. And I, of course, also very much appreciated your role as the April Fool at the university.
I think you've misspoken. It's not just April, it's year-round.
Oh, I see, okay.
I appreciate the tribute, but April, right. May, June, etc.
Terrific.
June Fool, currently now September Fool, I guess. Well, I'm going to tell a couple of personal stories. One of them is occurred a few hours ago when I read this morning's New York Times. First personal story is that there were two astoundingly great articles about injury and living with the memory of really hard times. One of them is a very excellent article on Afghanistan veterans, one particular unit that has a high rate of suicide and can't leave their past, try and leave their past behind, but having a hard time. The second one is about a woman named Mamie Lang Kirkland, who was 107 years old. When she was, I think, 7 years old, her family was just had to leave the horrors and the terrors of white threats in Ellisville, Mississippi. And she has just returned, where she was welcomed by the town. She was there with her son, and she spoke about her experiences. At one point, her son, who's 65, said to her, she came upon a few very painful stories, and she said, "Do I have to tell those stories?" And her son says, "You should. People have to know." So 2 incredibly great stories. Then a third really stupid story. The third story is about the Pope, who's a remarkable person, who's going to canonize Father Junipero Serra. And the article was one poor, lame draft of an article. It was fine. I mean, it had content that's important, that people of Mexican and Spanish descent care very much about this. This is a very big deal for those folks to have a figure from the Spanish history of what is now the United States recognized. So it's all about that. There's one paragraph about, some people say that Serra was not a positive influence in the life of Indian people. And that article, I just thought, what the hell has happened here? 2 great articles on historic trauma, and one so stupid and so flat. And it's not like people haven't been, Indian people in California and many other places have been talking about Father Sarah. If you wanted to find a way to spread disease among people, locking them up overnight, every night, in really confined spaces, if you wanted microbes and viruses to move around that population, there's no better way to do it. Anyway, so that was my most recent story, is reading the paper this morning and thinking, well, more colorful language than what the heck is going on there. So now I shall go back, though, for a second story, which shows me as a very thick-witted person, so, and showing many of the symptoms of perception that maybe New York Times reporters still have in some cases. So I grew up in Banning, California. On the edge of my town was a reservation, Cahuilla Indian people on that reservation. It was a small town, so we were in school together, and then then I moved out into the world. Years passed. I met a man, Alfonso Ortiz, who was a Tewa Indian, Tewa Pueblo Indian person. He said to me, this was in the early 1980s, he said to me, I'm very enchanted at meeting him. He's a very important figure in the world of Indian thinking and writing. And he says, have you known many Indian people? And I say, no. And then within seconds, I think, what came over me? Because I knew Indian people from when I was a kid, and they were not Plains Indians hunting buffalo on horseback in the 19th century. So apparently a fit of just extreme idiocy came over me, and I said no to Alfonso Ortiz. Within 5 seconds, I said, who said that? Why did I say that? But I just want to claim a little solidarity. Fortunately, I was able to write this book, Legacy of Conquest. It had a good impact, and some kind of redemption came upon me for that stupid moment. So that's all.
Okay. Thank you, Patty. And now I'd like to introduce Linda Hogan. The Chickasaw faculty at the Indian Arts Institute is in her background, former writer-in-residence for the Chickasaw Nation and professor emerita here at the University of Colorado. She is the author of many books, widely acclaimed, including Mean Spirit, which was a Pulitzer finalist. And I also want to indicate that she has recently received a fellowship from the Native Arts and Culture Foundation and the 2015 Thoreau Prize. So Linda, welcome.
Thank you. I was thinking of saying one thing, but I wanted to respond to something Patty said because she was speaking so quickly about the New York Times. I also saw the article, and it said, and I heard it on the radio while I was trying to get here this morning and lost, and they were talking about Father Junipero Serrano as being canonized, and they said that the committee said, well, it didn't matter that he did a few bad things. But the truth was he was a torturer and a killer and enslaved the tribal people in California and caused numerous deaths through starvation and other means. So these are important stories, and these are the kinds of things that a lot of us want to write about. They inspire us to write about these sorts of injustices that have taken place in the world. And then the fact that someone like that should not receive recognition. But historically, it's happened that over and over they receive recognition. I live close to the buffalo herd up on I-70, and sometimes I think, well, Buffalo Bill's grave is here, and what did Buffalo Bill really do? Historically, he's sort of a joke. He did very little. He killed buffalo, and he started a show where he really abused people, and they had no choice but to travel the world with him. So, but anyway, I was going to talk about how I became a writer, and I came from storytellers. And so we lived, we did not have water where I lived in Oklahoma at a young age, and also used a horse and wagon to go to town, to the community pump, Chinatri, Oklahoma, it was called then, and to get water in milk cans to take home in the wagon. And yet it was a very rich life. At night we sat outside and there were stories, everyone told stories. And so one day I was in Washington, D.C. area, driving on the Greenway, the Beltway, where my husband was working at the university. And I suddenly thought, I can't believe I'm driving this Beltway when I come from this other background. And here I am living in this contemporary world, but I'm really from the 19th century. And so I ended up thinking about the whole history that we had talked about. I felt like I'd lived through the Dust Bowl because of my family's conversations. I felt like I lived through the closing of the banks, through the Great Depression, through everything. My grandfather went with a gun after the banker when they closed the banks. My grandfather went to school with Frank and Jesse James. We came from ourselves an interesting history. And then there was the oil boom also in the 20s in Oklahoma. So my first novel became the story about the oil boom. I didn't see how many minutes that it said. Oh, okay. So anyway, what inspires me to write really is the social and racial injustice, the way we treat the natural world. All of my novels are about contemporary now, since Mean Spirit, contemporary political events. The James Bay Hydro-Quebec project is part of the story of solar storms. I'm working on now Chevron in the rainforest, the Amazonia. I worked on the killing of, did a novel on the killing of Florida panther, one of the most endangered species at the time. There were only 12 left. I have to say that at the time I was on a working group for the reauthorization of the Endangered Species Act when I first heard about the Florida panther. And I went there to write a legal article and stayed in Idabel and in the Everglades with the panther ranger and did research. I read all the court records and all the lies that people told and the things that I can't go into because I only have 5 minutes. But right now we have so many things going on. With the Apache land is being, the stronghold that people in the Apache land are fighting, having a mine there, which is a mine that goes not just for the United States, but for Iran. And there are, all over the country right now, are issues that are of great importance. Our own tribe had the United States pretend as if we were not our sovereign nation and go in and cut acres, miles of forest from our forests without our own permission. And I wanted to write about it when I worked for the tribe, and they wouldn't let me because it was under legal, it was in court. But I was going to talk about what made me start writing, and I was not a privileged person who would write, but I became a person who learned and taught myself to write, to tell all these important stories.
Oh, hear, hear. And I think the theme that you've sounded here, Linda, is so important that even today, after all that you all have written and so many people have written, there remains, I think, from my own experience, a huge chasm, certainly in the mainstream culture, of almost complete misunderstanding of our Native American history, complete ignorance of these many, many injustices. So in the time we've got here, I'd like to start going around and what is on your mind and in your heart, Deborah, about what kinds of misunderstandings or just sheer ignorance you could clarify in this very limited time we have together?
Because I had, for a better part of 10 years, proximity to Vine Deloria Jr. My office was just down tiny hallway from the most prominent American Indian intellectual by many measures. And he had an extraordinary sense of humor, and that's what I feel is the missing component. If you look at an Edward Curtis photograph of a person, an Indian person from the early 20th century who is just fading away, just frozen in time, and if you want to counter that, Vine Deloria's sense of humor is, I feel, the most targeted and direct way to do that. And there are many other people, Sherman Alexie, well, there's people sitting here with me, for heaven's sake, who have merry senses of humor. And that seems to me the best way. Phil Deloria, Vine's son, I just learned 2 weeks ago when I was fortunate to spend time with him, he is working on an anthology of American Indian humor. The writers are American Indian academics who are writing about funny subjects and Indian humor, but who are themselves very funny. So that is a book that I think will be huge. Phil's own essay, I think he said his topic was probably going to be why it is when you go to a massage place or a spa, you are very likely to hear Indian flute music. Even though koto music would be just as good in some way, but many other world musics on that one, but how his essay is about how that prevailed. So that's what I would like to say. And then in that spirit, Will Wilson, who is a very funny person and a very gifted photographer, Navajo Diné photographer, he'll be here on October 26th. He does photographs in the Curtis manner. He takes photographs of Indian people in wet plate photography, and he's expanded to take photographs now of some non-Indian people in alliance with Indians. So I have a picture of myself taken in the Curtis manner when it was being developed in the kind of black room or dark room area. My skin was getting darker and darker as it developed, and I said to Will, so that's really a Curtis thing, your skin gets darker and darker. And he said, yes, by taking photographs of non-Indians, he said, I'm indigenizing North America one person at a time. So that is what I feel so strongly about. Get the humor and play.
Okay, now the time has come to actually open it up, open the circle. If you would raise your hand or stand, make yourself prominent if you'd like to make a comment or ask a specific question of any one of the panelists. Here's someone right over here. Is there a mic out here, John?
Yeah, we're going to steal one from you.
I was interested in your comment about being a Catholic. If we go back far enough to the Revolutionary War, my family was Jewish. My mother was a Presbyterian. My father was an atheist. I married a Catholic. And guess what? Trogon Trungpa Rinpoche converted me to Buddhism. So now I write books.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
Exactly what we all do, except for leaving out the Jewish part.
Yeah.
Add in indigenous
We're all indigenous to the planet.
somewhere.
Hello. I just want to make a quick comment because we are out of time. My comment is that in the last 500 years, actually last 1,000 years, there have been a lot of colonizations, first by the Middle Eastern, then the Europeans, and they invaded ancient lands, including India, colonized, destroyed. I've been reading Michael Denino, literally destroyed, saying this everything which is native is nonsense. And what we are bringing is the European culture that needs to, we need to educate these people. So now the question is that if you compare as a scientist, and I'm not a historian, but I've been comparing in my own way commonality amongst colonization. We're talking to a person in Hawaii during our visit, and it becomes clear, you read Howard Zinn. So for this panel and for this festival, one issue is to bring out the commonality. It's not just the Native Americans, not just the Indians from India, but all over the world, it's going on even now, Afghanistan, Iraq, to really bring out what the colonizers have done and what we need to do, we means collectively, to take steps in our own way to bring some balance to this one-sided view of the world, which is Western only, We need to assimilate other views, and so that's my comment.
Thank you.
One thing about colonization is the desire to have the sameness of everybody be exactly alike. And so to assimilate people, and part of it has to do with slavery and work, which is what we see right now going on in the world with the fishing industry. And this has been the history of the colonizing nations who destroy their own lands and then proceed to go elsewhere and destroy tribal histories, tribal ways of being, and then to also take over those lands and change them. And so when we go back, now we're in the process really of trying to decolonize ourselves, go back to look at the history that we come from, the way we used agriculture, those who were the keepers of seeds, and be able to recreate and start our world to make it as healthy as it once was, at the same time that we know that the destruction is taking place. There's a website on, it's called Food Sovereignty is Native Sovereignty. And it's about the significance of taking care of every part of the land. No GMOs, no pesticides, just take care of every part of it, all the way to the human beings, so that there are not people who are farm laborers who are being treated badly and getting sprayed with pesticides. I mean, it's like this is the most far-reaching, colonization has been the most far-reaching and destructive force we have, and we cannot continue to have capitalism because that is at the root of it. So we have to find another way of being in our policy making and in our real democracy.
I'd like to add to that, actually, in this larger picture that my wife Edna has been saying for some years now, looking at our contemporary dramas here in the United States and elsewhere, that now we're all being treated like Indians. And one of the people on my Living Dialogues program picked up on that and said, I can't get Edna's comment out of my mind. It's true. We're all being held close to the fort by debt and big box retail. And so this issue of colonization and the colonization of our minds goes really, I think, throughout the planet. And these last comments, I think, are very much linking the history of foundational stories and what's really relevant to all of us now today. So I think we have time for one or two more questions. I can't see in the dark there.
I'm so sorry you can't see
Somebody
in the dark.
waving
I wish
their
you
hand?
could. I came in late, but I do want to thank the panel for their historical content and their enthusiasm in reflection of the Native Americans. But I'm kind of curious to why the panel didn't include any Native Americans to talk for themselves. There are generation after generation after generation. Excuse me. Okay, may I finish? Okay, may I finish? May I finish? May I finish, please? I'm talking I'm talking more
women.
about people of color. People of color, yeah. And
Sorry,
Hey, there's
color.
Yeah, well, I
Can I
guess-
say, it's kind of funny, Louise Erdrich has this saying where when people say to her, well, you don't look Indian, and she says, well, it's funny, you don't look rude.
are you suggesting
I
I'm
made
rude?
that comment to this, I waited.
Are you suggesting that I'm rude to ask the question? Because obviously this
Where are
microphone
you? I
has
can't
come.
see you.
This microphone has come around to get input from your audience, and I'm part of your audience.
Yes, but to say that, to define Indian people through their color, haven't we gotten beyond that? I think the old Indian agents used to come in on the reservations and say, you're dark, you look like you're Indian and you're not. You know, my mother had vitiligo. She was so dark that that I was called a mulatto. My mother had very dark skin. She was full blood. And she lost all of her skin after a traumatic event. She lost all her pigment in her skin after a traumatic event. And so, does that make her less Indian? Do we look at when?
And I think that's a very good question. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to close down the panel now.
I have to say something about this because it brings up the most important topic, which is how little non-Indian people know about us, and how little non-Indian people have stayed in touch with what's happened in our communities. And one of my granddaughters, two of my granddaughters from my very dark daughter, who has a son who has creamy skin like myself, two of my granddaughters are one, I call them Snow White and Rose Red. One is very dark and one is very light, and they're sisters. And the thing is that on the reservation, everybody knows who they are. Everybody knows that they're from the same mother. Everybody knows that they're both Native. And in fact, my light-skinned granddaughter is more traditional. She's more of a traditionalist than my dark-skinned granddaughter. So we have differences in our color just on our reservations, just as you do in your own communities. We're colored. We just aren't colored in the ways that you have learned.
Yeah, this is a terrific way. Thank you so much.